This morning's public hearing that we're having is on Pennsylvania CO2 and the Climate. And we have a number of guests with us today. I was talking with our House security, and if anybody's going to be staying in attendance, unless you're the press, if you could please take one of the seats that are available. We still have some seats left, but they are going to ask that everybody's seated today. And would also like to remind the members of the committee that all the folks that we'll be talking with here today and questioning and hearing testimony from are all our guests, and that we want to make sure that their time is respected and their presentation is respected. This isn't time for us to debate with our guests. They're here to provide information. We'll debate amongst each other on this issue, I know, later at other meetings. But today is not an opportunity for us to debate with our guests. It's an opportunity for us to receive testimony from our guests, and then we'll digest that and debate that amongst ourselves at a future meeting. So while we are doing the Q&A, we'd ask members to hold their questions to one question per member, and if we have time to go back for a second question with any one of the members that might have had a second question, then we'll do a second round of questions if we still have time with that guest. But we're going to attempt to stay with the timings that are outlined in today's schedule so that we respect both the time of our guests and the time of the members that are here participating today. Yeah, that kind of really jumps out at you that clean energy jobs account for 1 out of 3 energy jobs in Pennsylvania, but employs more than twice the number of workers in Pennsylvania's entire fossil fuel industry. So 2 out of 3 jobs aren't clean energy. So, but I mean, just doesn't make sense how those numbers would work out, but I would like to see the data also that you're referencing for that, because if it's not, I mean, it's certainly not any federal numbers, it doesn't seem to be, or even state.
We can get
you the numbers.
No, we can get you the basis for those jobs. I will say we've seen two things. One, with programs like Act 129 and some of the utility programs, we've seen significant uptake in energy efficiency. And then on the renewable side, a few now of our service territories have seen a real cost competitiveness with solar panels compared to what their price to compare is. So we've seen more uptake in rooftop solar, for example, across the state, and a pretty significant expansion of that over the last 3 years.
Just in western Pennsylvania, I've not seen too many people driving around in trucks with solar panels, but I've seen a lot of trucks driving around for the Marcellus Shale development and some of the activity going on with the cracker facility in our area. The RGGI, as you and I had talked about previously, as I'd stressed to you in those previous discussions, with the governor's executive order and ultimately what would occur as a result of being part of RGGI, which would be a new tax for Pennsylvania, a CO2 tax or fee, whatever somebody wants to call it, but ultimately it's going to effectively be a cap and tax plan that's going to cap the carbon emissions for certain businesses and tax them if they're going to if they're going to generate any additional or have to buy somebody else's credits of sort. But the executive branch, of course, is the branch that's supposed to enforce the law. Everybody learns that, pretty much in grade school. 3 branches of government: legislative executes the policy, drafts the policy, adopts policy. The chief executive signs off on that or vetoes it, gets overrode. But the executive is supposed to enforce the law, not make the law, not make policy. It's supposed to enforce the policy made by the legislative branch. So the governor, in his announcement of his executive order, certainly wasn't definitive in his own belief that he had the authority to actually implement the regulations ultimately that would adopt RGGI fully. And there's many of us that are concerned that if the executive branch tries to move forward with joining RGGI, that they would not do so without the approval of the legislature to actually provide the policy change that would allow a tax to be collected. Can you can you assure us of that today, that you're going to be back to see us for whatever tax is going to be needed to implement the RGGI strategy?
Sure. So the two things I'd say are, one, I think the governor and I have been very clear that we are, one of the reasons, frankly, I want to be here at these kind of events is that we want to work with the legislature as we implement and put the rule together. I will say, I think, and it's not just the Air Pollution Control Act, it's many of our legislative authorities are written in ways that recognize that things change over time. So carbon, again, according to federal government at this point, is a regulated pollutant. It's something that we have an obligation to address, and the kind of trading program that RGGI would include is something that we have seen used for SO2 and NOx. We absolutely want to be working with the legislature through this process, but as I said last time I was before you, there's also an urgency, and I think providing a timeline around dealing with that urgency is equally important.
But the social cost that you had touched on in your testimony and you said the class of models proposed as basis for regulatory policy by the Obama administration, that's the current social cost that's being used in many states as we're looking at these different proposals that are being proffered by different governors and such across the country. They're using the Obama social cost
So it depends on what the state is doing. They are all entitled to use their own assumptions, but the point I've made is that lawmakers in the past have had a habit to beef up, to use particular assumptions to beef up the results, which is what exactly happened under the Obama administration. And I'm not going to be surprised if state lawmakers regulators try to do this as well.
Thank you. And Dr. Legates, do you know, did Delaware use the Obama social cost information?
I believe we did.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. We appreciate you joining us today. I think it's obvious from your question, Representative Rapp's question, that these gentlemen haven't factored in the cost of recycling or how to deal with the types of energy that they're actually promoting. I mean, your organizations really don't seem, from the way that you haven't provided answers to those two series of questions, you haven't actually looked at the cost associated with using the types of technology that you're advocating for versus the types that you're criticizing.
We'll
Is
make
that correct?
studies available to you, Representative.
What's that?
We'll make studies available to you.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. Have a good day. And just as we're changing panels, Representative Rapp touched on it, Representative Fritz touched on it. If the testimony wouldn't have come in late last night, we would have caught that there was such disparaging remarks that were put in the testimony from our Mr. Masser, with Penn Environment, to make the types of comparisons he did in trying to disparage people on the other side of the argument. Ultimately, I think shows the type of arguments that he's proffering, but wouldn't have been allowed if they would have been seen prior to this morning by myself. And as I said, my research analyst said he received that last night, and we certainly would have nipped that one in the bud to let the testifier know that would not be acceptable type of testimony to this committee of the House of Representatives to put in such disparaging remarks, just going on the attack on people that oppose your ideas. This is supposed to be for a exchange of information, and we hopefully will lend itself to policy considerations that are going to benefit the people of Pennsylvania, and disparaging remarks such as those don't lend itself to that at all.
For the record, Mr. Mazur's remarks were not disparaging, in my opinion, and in fact were very compelling.
Representative Vitale, you are out of order, and your opinion wasn't asked for, but I think that any citizen reading that would recognize those types of remarks are disparaging, trying to make that type of an alignment with people that oppose your ideas. So please shut your microphone off, sir. You're not recognized at this time. We're moving on to our next panel. Thank you, Representative Vitale.
Well, I'll just respectfully disagree with you.
Can we get this up?
Thank you. Doctor, in your testimony, you referenced a per capita cost for CO2. when you were talking. And in that calculation of per capita costs for each individual for CO2, does that calculation include the individual CO2 just coming from them breathing in their life? Does it include the types of, or what their diet might consist of, if they enjoy a lot of meat in their diet? I mean, we've got the mayor of New York that started his Meatless Mondays with his attack on global warming to stop school children from eating meat on Mondays to try and reduce the reliance on beef and cattle. You have Bernie Sanders, who, answering a question, talked about how he believes that we should have population controls in place because of the CO2 emitted by individual people. Does that calculation per capita just include CO2 from energy production, or does it include the CO2 for those individuals also, and including extrapolating out what those individuals consume in their diets?
So the numbers that I showed you you can also find them in in table 6 that I have attached, which is a table from the energy-related carbon dioxide emissions by state released in February 2019. This is U.S. Energy Information Administration. The number includes per capita energy-related carbon dioxide emissions by state 2005 to 2016. So no, it doesn't include those factors that you're talking about.
So it just includes the
Per capita energy-related
great.
carbon dioxide emissions.
Thank you. And you mentioned China in one of your diagrams, and the percentage that they're actually contributing to CO2 from energy production. I assume that would just be energy production also. But
this
with
is
them,
the total carbon emissions, and China is number one as of 2006, right? Yeah.
So with China on the move to create more coal-powered fire plants, along with, I believe, India, other countries that aren't necessarily buying into this or not believing they should play a part in it because they're trying to raise the level of wealth in their countries to try and raise their people out of poverty, as we've seen done in the United States with our creation of more and more energy, because there's a direct correlation. What's both of you as individuals with who you're representing and the work that you're representing here, how do you balance your call for the United States to go to zero CO2 emissions for energy production when China and India are not going to pay attention to it? I mean, if we did go to zero, we wouldn't offset all of what they're going to create and increase.
Actually, both of these have signed the Paris Agreement, and the call of the international communities for all countries to apply this reduction and going to zero net CO2 emissions by 2050.
So is China abiding by it, though? I mean, China's creating more coal-powered fire plants. So how are they signing? They're signing onto an agreement, but not abiding by it. Correct?
Correct.
I would just add that we can't control what China does, nor can I predict what China's going to do. Our focus is on what we can do here. And
would you believe?
Because every day that goes by that we don't act, we make the impacts worse.
But you believe that citizens of the United States of America should make sacrifices and increase energy costs that won't ultimately have an impact on the whole because of what China and India are going to choose to do with their own CO2 emissions. We should just reduce ours, even though they're going to increase theirs.
I would argue that it does make a significant impact. We don't know if it's going to increase costs or not. In fact, a lot of studies point that it actually could decrease costs, and we're talking about investment in the types of technologies that we're going to need in the decades to come, whether those be clean or renewable.
Thank you. Final question from Representative Dush. And I appreciated the headlines that you were showing with all the contradictions out of the
It's settled science.
Right. Kind of out of the fear-mongering climate change crowd. I mean, I think the majority of people do believe climate change happens. It's called weather. I mean, that's why we get up in the morning and we watch the weather for the day. I mean, that's why I decide I'm wearing a jacket today or not, because I'm believing the weather's going to change today, and I know it's going to change in a couple of weeks. I'm going to pull my winter coat out again. Yes. So I think the majority of us are not deniers of climate change. We believe the climate changes. We believe the weather changes. But all of this fear mongering, and that's what as I've been here in the legislature, I remember back to those days of being in elementary school in the 60s and 70s, and in the 70s the coming ice age. You remember some of the I don't know, cartoons or what I forget how they were trying to market it to some of the young people at that time, but I remember being struck as a child by that, thinking, oh wow, there's an ice age coming, and it just seemed like science fiction the way it was presented at the time, as some of this does. I mean, if you watch a good science fiction movie, you'll watch some of the same things being said with the meteorites that are heading for the Earth and going to destroy the whole Earth. All of a sudden, is what you're hearing coming out of some of these people that are claiming that the sky is falling. The sky is falling like Chicken Little did. But I appreciate your putting those headlines up, because I think showing the contradiction in amongst their own crowd, and they're so quick to change those and to move on to a new prophecy, to a new fallacy, to try and fool the public. I mean, and you went through them very fast. I don't know for anybody watching the hearing if they caught what you were doing, but it wasn't you claiming these things. No, it was you were showing headlines from some of these noted groups or individuals that were advocating that we have some huge crisis on the horizon that we have to deal with, whether it's global warming or a coming ice age.
It's an amazing thing, because they can predict both outcomes. If you're betting on the Super Bowl and you bet both sides to win, you can go to the office the next day and say, hey, I predicted it. And what they've done here is over and over again on almost every issue with the climate debate, they claim all these different scenarios. So no matter what happens, they have that basis. But interestingly enough, when the United Nations comes forward with all of these, outlandish predictions from their summary of report, the underlying reports of the UN are actually sometimes very good, and they actually quote all the extreme weather. But it's all done as a lobbying campaign. And Al Gore was on, I think it was CNN not too long ago, and he said, of course the IPCC reports are, quote, torqued up. That was his word. This is a lobbying organization, and this is how they end up coming up with all of these scenarios, and this is why someone referenced the ClimateGate scandal earlier. This is why they were internally suppressing any scientists who disagreed, threatening journal editors, and telling them that if you publish this guy's work who dissents from our essentially campaign narrative, your career will be over. But my main message is don't fall into this trap, Pennsylvania, because there's nothing that you can do to do the climate. All you can do is ruin your state as one of the greatest energy successes in America through the fracking boom. And you can teach New York. New York has nothing to teach you about energy.
I agree that New York has nothing to teach us regarding energy. They just need to let our pipeline across so we don't have to see Russian gas brought in and sold to the folks in Massachusetts, because we can't get our gas up there. Today, and thank you to all of our testifiers and to the committee today for bearing with a longer hearing than normal.
Thank you.
2 hours usually just the right time. 3 hours was actually, we could have used more time, because I think Dr. Legates had a dissertation that I would have enjoyed hearing more on, some more details of that. So I appreciate all of our testifiers. Some of you spoke very fast to try and get the information in. I wish we would have had more time for all of you to have more Q&A and more time. But that's the way the schedule dictates at times. This room we have to give up at 11:30. That's why we started at 8 this morning, because we could get in a little ahead of the clock instead of on the back end. So thank you all. I do look forward to further debate on this. I've been hearing from some constituents on the issue over time. There's a lot of surveys that get talked about, but I think a lot of folks don't consider government mandates to be market-based initiatives, and a lot of folks see through the attempt to take more out of their pockets as consumers and more out of the pockets of companies when the governor's not able to get his $4.5 billion severance tax increase. A lot of folks see through this as just another way for the governor to try and extract more out of the pockets of the hardworking people of Pennsylvania. So we'll continue the debate. Look forward to it. Motion to adjourn by Representative Fritz. Seconded by Representative Vitale.